The Dakota wind has a voice. Most settlers hear it as a threat, a high, lonesome cry that promises frost and starvation. But for a woman alone, a woman like Martha O'Connell, you learn to listen closer. You learn to tell the difference between the shriek of a simple gale and the moan of a true blizzard, the kind that can strip the paint from your house and the life from your bones. On a bitter November evening in 1878, the wind didn't just moan, it carried a sound that was altogether different. It was the sound of a life, small and desperate, about to be extinguished. And the choice Martha made in the next hour would either sign her own death warrant or change the very soul of the valley forever. The cabin felt like the last bastion of warmth on a frozen planet. Outside, the world had been erased by a furious swirl of white. The blizzard had descended upon the plains of the Dakota Territory, without warning, a monstrous, howling thing that locals called a white wolf. It devoured landmarks, swallowed the horizon, and screamed with a voice that rattled the very logs of Martha O'Connell's small homestead. Martha was a widow of 2 years. Her husband, Sean, a man with a spirit as broad as the land he'd claimed, had been taken by a fever that moved as quickly and mercilessly as this very storm. All she had left of him were this sturdy one-room cabin, a stubborn mule named Bartholomew, a handful of chickens, and the aching silence that had become her constant companion. The silence at least was gone tonight, replaced by the symphony of the storm's fury. She stoked the fire in the stone hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows that made the familiar room seem strange and menacing. Every creak of the wood, every shudder of the window panes sent a fresh tremor of unease through her. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy, but a storm like this made you feel small. It made you remember every ghost story you'd ever heard, every tale of travelers lost just feet from their own doorstep, their bodies found in the spring thaw. It was then that she heard it. At first she thought it was a trick of the wind, a peculiar pitch in its unending howl. But it came again sharper this time, thin and desperate. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the scream of a cougar. It was human. A child, it sounded like. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the warmth of the fire. No one should be out in this. The nearest neighbor, the prickly old prospector, Silas Croft, was 3 miles east. The settlement of Redemption Gulch was a hard 10-mile ride west. To be caught out here now was a death sentence. She pulled Sean's heavy wool coat from its peg by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Part of her, the sensible, terrified part, screamed to stay inside, to bar the door, and pretend she'd heard nothing. It was suicide to open the door to this white hell. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a thread of a cry nearly snipped by the gale. It was the sound of a child. "Lord, forgive my foolishness," she muttered, grabbing the oil lantern from the mantelpiece. Lighting it was a struggle, her hands trembling. With the lantern held high, she unbolted the heavy plank door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open with a deafening crash. A wall of ice and snow blasted into the cabin, extinguishing the lantern instantly and sending a flurry of embers skittering from the hearth. The room plunged into a chaotic, roaring darkness, lit only by the faint, angry glow of the fire. For a moment or she saw nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Then a shape. A small, dark heap, huddled against the woodpile, not 10 feet from her porch. It was so covered in snow, it was barely distinguishable from a frost-heaved rock. Fighting the wind that threatened to tear the clothes from her back, Martha stumbled outside. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath and burning her lungs. She reached the shape and brushed away the snow. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, his face blue with cold, his body racked with violent shivers. His clothes were not the wool and denim of a settler's child. They were buckskin, adorned with simple beadwork. His long black hair was matted with ice. He was Lakota. Every horror story she had ever heard in Redemption Gulch flooded her mind. Tales of raids, of savagery, of the unbridgeable chasm between her people and his. The Custer fight at the Little Bighorn was only 2 years past, and the animosity was a raw, open wound across the territory. To harbor one of them, it was unthinkable. They'd call her a traitor. Worse. Jedediah Kane, the powerful rancher whose land bordered her own and who had made no secret of his desire to absorb her modest plot, would use it as the perfect excuse to run her out. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark pools of terror and pain, but in their depths she saw no malice. She saw a child freezing to death on her doorstep. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. In that instant, the politics, the fear, and the warnings of redemption, Gulch dissolved into the roar of the blizzard. Sean's voice echoed in her memory, a low, warm rumble from a fireside long ago. A person's a person, Martha. You judge them by the soul in their eyes, not the clothes on their back or the stories others tell. Her soul recoiled from the thought of leaving a child to die. "All right, son," she said, her voice swallowed by the wind. "All right. We're going inside." He was light, frighteningly so, but his limbs were stiff with cold. She half dragged, half carried him, fighting her way back to the gaping maw of the cabin door. With a final desperate shove of her shoulder, she got them both inside and threw her weight against the door, finally managing to slam it shut and drop the bolt. The sudden relative silence was deafening. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the boy's ragged, shallow breaths. He lay on the floor, a frozen, still figure in the heart of her home. Martha O'Connell, the widow who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had just invited the entire, complicated, dangerous world across her threshold. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break. The boy lay on the bearskin rug before the fire, as still and silent as a stone. Martha worked with a frantic, focused energy, born of pure adrenaline. She stripped away his frozen buckskin garments, her fingers clumsy and numb. His skin was shockingly cold, almost waxy to the touch. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was too late, but then a tremor ran through his small frame, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that seemed to rack his very bones. He was alive. Thank God, she whispered the prayer, a plume of white in the chilled air of the cabin. She wrapped him in her thickest wool blankets, the ones she saved for the coldest nights, and began rubbing his hands and feet, trying to force life and warmth back into them. He made no sound, his dark eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling beams tracking the play of the firelight. Was it fear or exhaustion that kept him so silent she couldn't tell? She brewed a weak broth of dried beef and herbs, the smell filling the small cabin. When it was warm, she propped his head up and brought a spoonful to his lips. He turned his head away, his jaw clenched. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice gentle as if soothing a spooked foal. "It's just broth. For strength." She tried again, and this time his lips parted. He took a small, hesitant sip, then another. The simple act of him accepting her help felt like a monumental victory, a fragile truce declared in the heart of the storm. As the hours wore on, the cabin became a sanctuary suspended in time. Outside, the white wolf raged, but inside a strange peace settled. The boy, wrapped in his cocoon of blankets, finally drifted into an exhausted sleep. The shivering subsided, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing. Martha sat in her rocking chair, Sean's shotgun laid across her lap. She didn't truly believe the boy was a threat, but the habits of a lone woman in a hard land died hard. She watched him sleep, the firelight softening the angles of his face. He looked so young, so vulnerable. His hair, now dry, was a sheet of polished obsidian. His buckskin clothes laid out to dry near the hearth were meticulously stitched. A small leather pouch had been tied to his belt. It had fallen to the floor when she'd undressed him. Curiosity warred with her sense of propriety. She told herself she needed to know if he was carrying anything dangerous, but it was more than that. She wanted to understand who he was. With a trembling hand, she picked up the pouch. The leather was soft, worn with use. Inside, she found not a knife or a weapon, but 3 objects. The first was a smooth grey river stone, worn into the shape of a bird in flight. The second was a single perfect hawk feather. The third was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its legs no thicker than a matchstick. It was a child's treasures, the tokens of a life filled with quiet observation and simple joys. A wave of profound sadness washed over her. This wasn't a savage warrior in training. This was a little boy who loved birds and horses, who carried a pretty stone in his pocket, just like any boy in Redemption Gulch might. A boy with a mother, a father, a family somewhere out in that frozen hell, their hearts breaking with worry. She placed the items carefully back in the pouch and set it beside him. The shotgun on her lap suddenly felt heavy and ridiculous. She leaned over and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm now. The night deepened. Martha dozed in her chair, waking with a start at every particularly violent gust of wind. In the quiet moments between the howls, she found herself thinking of Sean. He would have approved. He had always possessed a deep, abiding respect for the Lakota, seeing them not as enemies, but as a people who understood the land in a way the settlers never could. "We're guests here, Martha," he used to say, looking out at the endless plains. "We just have a bad habit of acting like we own the place." Jedediah Kane, on the other hand, saw the land as something to be conquered, tamed, and broken. He saw the Lakota as vermin to be cleared. Kane and Sean had clashed more than once over a small creek that ran through both their properties. Kane wanted to dam it to water his ever-expanding herd of cattle, heedless of the fact that it would dry up Martha's well and choke the cottonwood grove downstream, a place the Lakota held sacred. Sean's sudden death had left the issue unresolved, a simmering ember of conflict she dreaded Kane would one day reignite. Looking at the sleeping boy, she realized the conflict was no longer distant. It was right here, breathing softly in her cabin. Her act of simple human decency had drawn a line in the sand. Toward the hour before dawn, the boy stirred. He sat up, his eyes wide and alert. He looked at the fire, then at his dry clothes, then at her. He pointed a small finger toward the door. "The storm," Martha said, understanding his silent question. She went to the window, rubbing a clear patch in the frost. The wind had lessened, its howl diminished to a weary moan. The snow was still falling, but lightly now. "It's breaking. You'll be able to go soon." A complicated emotion flickered in her chest. Relief, yes, but also a strange sort of regret. The silence she had once cherished now seemed to promise a return to a deeper, more profound loneliness. The boy stood up, his movements still stiff. He walked over to his clothes and began to dress. He did so with a quiet dignity that was startling in one so young. When he was done, he picked up his small pouch of treasures. He looked at Martha, a long, unblinking gaze. He said nothing. He didn't know the words, and Even if he did, they would have been inadequate. Instead, he did something that struck her to the core. He reached into his pouch, took out the small carved wooden horse, and held it out to her. A gift, a payment, an acknowledgement. Tears pricked at Martha's eyes. "No child," she whispered, her voice thick. "You keep your horse." She walked to her own cupboard and took out a small parcel wrapped in cloth. It was a half loaf of her cornbread and a piece of salted jerky. She pushed it into his hands. He looked down at the offering, then back at her. For the first time, a flicker of a smile touched his lips. He walked to the door. Martha unbolted it. The pre-dawn air was frigid, clean, and sharp. The world was a blanket of pristine, blue-tinged white. The plains were transformed a landscape of sweeping, silent beauty. The boy paused on the threshold, then turned. He raised a hand, palm flat, a gesture of peace she had seen from a distance, but never received. Then, without a backward glance, he stepped out into the snow and began to walk a small, solitary figure, moving with purpose toward the rising sun. Martha watched until he was a tiny speck, swallowed by the vast white expanse. She closed the door, the warmth of her cabin suddenly feeling empty. On the floor by the hearth lay a single hawk feather. He had left it behind. A second gift. She picked it up, its delicate structure, a marvel of nature's design, and knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the storm, that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Sunrise came, painting the snow-covered plains in hues of soft pink and brilliant gold. The world felt scrubbed clean, reborn. The silence that returned was absolute, a profound stillness that was the blizzard's final legacy. Martha O'Connell stood on her porch, a mug of steaming coffee warming her hands, and surveyed the changed landscape. The snow was easily 3 feet deep in the drifts, a vast, unbroken sheet of white that smoothed the harsh edges of the land. Her eyes followed the boy's faint trail, already being softened by the morning sun until it disappeared over a low rise to the east. She prayed he had found his people. She held the hawk feather in her pocket, its soft edge a constant reminder of the previous night's impossible events. The wooden horse he had offered sat on her mantelpiece. She had found it placed there after he'd left. He had insisted silently. The day passed in a haze of chores made difficult by the deep snow. She dug a path to the chicken coop, fed the complaining Bartholomew, and cleared the snow from her windows. The physical labor was a comfort, a way to keep her mind from spinning on the potential consequences of her actions. What would she say if someone from town rode out? What would she do if Jedediah Kane came calling? She resolved to say nothing. It was her secret, a strange and dangerous memory, shared only with a silent Lakota boy. She slept fitfully that night, the shotgun once again within arm's reach. The silence of the cabin felt different now, heavier. It was no longer just the absence of Sean. It was the absence of the small breathing presence that had filled it for one brief night. The next morning she awoke just before dawn, as was her habit. She lit the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and went to the door to greet the day. She lifted the bolt, pulled the thick door inward, and froze. Her porch was covered. It wasn't snow. It was an astonishing array of gifts laid out with deliberate care upon the wooden planks. There were 3 thick, beautifully tanned buffalo hides, the leather supple and rich-smelling enough to keep her warm for a dozen winters. Beside them lay a pile of dried venison, neatly bundled with sinew. There was a leather pouch filled with wajapi, a sweet, dark berry pudding, and another containing medicinal herbs she recognized from her mother's old botany books. Yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain. But it was the craftsmanship that stole her breath. There was a pair of moccasins sized perfectly for a woman, adorned with intricate quill work in a pattern of interlocking blue and white diamonds. And beside them, leaning against the cabin wall, was a cradle board. It was a masterpiece of woodwork and beadwork, the leather hood stitched with a stunning, vibrant sunburst design. It was a gift for a mother for a new baby. Martha's hands flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her throat. She and Sean had tried for a child for years, a quiet heartache that had shadowed their happy marriage. The sight of that empty, hopeful cradle board was a knife to the heart, yet it was so clearly given with honor and respect that the pain was mingled with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. Her gaze swept over the gifts again, and she saw one more item set apart from the rest. It was a single, long-tailed eagle feather, its base wrapped in red-dyed leather. She knew enough to understand its significance. It was not a casual gift. It was a mark of immense respect, a symbol of honor and courage. They had come in the dead of night as silently as ghosts. They had seen the boy's tracks leading to her door and not away. They had understood. They had seen her single set of tracks from the day before, going to the coop and the barn, and knew she was alone. They had looked at her life from a distance and seen what she needed. Not just food and hides for survival, but a recognition of her womanhood, of the family she didn't have. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks in the cold morning air. This wasn't charity. It was a message. It was a statement of profound, reciprocal grace. An act of compassion repaid in kind, a bridge built across a chasm of hatred and fear, all because of one cold night and one small boy. She stood there for a long time, until the sun had fully risen, a lone woman on a small porch, surrounded by the unbelievable bounty of a people she had been taught to fear. She knew with a sinking feeling in her stomach that tempered the warmth in her heart that this act of kindness couldn't be hidden. Her homestead was visible from the low ridge that Cain's men sometimes rode. The bounty on her porch was a declaration, and in this part of the country, some declarations were seen as acts of war. The Lakota had thanked her, but they might have just signed her death warrant. 3 days passed before Martha could make the journey into Redemption Gulch. The snow remained deep, and she spent the time securing her newfound bounty, hiding the more valuable hides in the small root cellar beneath the cabin floor, and storing the meat. The exquisite cradle board she wrapped in a blanket, and placed in Sean's old steamer trunk, a gesture of reverence for a future that would never be. The moccasins, however, she wore. They fit as if made for her, and with every step she felt a strange connection to the unknown hands that had crafted them. The ride into town was slow and arduous, Bartholomew grumbling with every step through the slushy, half-melted snow. Redemption Gulch wasn't much more than a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, but it was the only source of flour salt and news for 50 miles. As she tethered Bartholomew outside the general store, she felt a change in the atmosphere. The usual gruff nods and tips of the hat from prospectors and farmhands were absent. Instead, she was met with cold stares and hushed whispers that ceased the moment she turned her head. The store's proprietor, a portly, nervous man named Silas Croft, polished the counter with a vigor that betrayed his anxiety. "Martha," he mumbled, not meeting her eye. "Terrible storm." "It was Silas. I need flour and coffee." As he measured out the flour, the door swung open, the bell above it jangling violently. Jedediah Cain filled the doorway, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands, their faces set in grim lines. Cain was a big man, his wealth and influence doing nothing to soften a core of pure granite brutality. His eyes, small and dark like chips of obsidian, immediately found Martha. "Well, well!" Kane's voice boomed, a gravelly sound that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. "Look what the blizzard blew in. The little Indian lover herself." A cold dread washed over Martha. She had known this was coming, but the speed and venom of it still shocked her. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jedediah." "Don't you?" He took a menacing step forward, his spurs jingling on the floorboards. "My men rode the North Ridge yesterday, saw your little homestead, saw the King of Sheba's ransom sitting on your porch, buffalo hides beadwork. Looks like you had some visitors, the kind we hang around here." The other men in the store shuffled their feet, their eyes darting between Kane and Martha. No one spoke. Their silence was a form of consent. "A gift is a gift, Jedediah," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly, but she forced it to hold steady. "It's no business of yours. Trump said yo. It's the business of every white man in this territory when one of our own starts trading with savages," he roared, slamming a meaty fist on the counter. Silas Croft jumped, spilling a scoop of flour onto the floor. "That boy you sheltered, did you think no one would find out? Little Bear Cub, they call him. Son of Black Buffalo Horn himself. A chief's son. You didn't just give a blanket to a stray. You gave aid and comfort to the enemy." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Black Buffalo Horn was a name spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. His band of Lakota had stubbornly refused to be confined to the reservation, and they were blamed for every missing cow and every spooked horse in the county. Martha's heart pounded. The boy was a chief's son. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just skyrocketed. "I sheltered a child from a blizzard," she said, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "He was freezing to death. I'd have done the same for your child or anyone's." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't you compare my blood to that filth. You've chosen your side, Martha. My offer for your land is officially off the table. I wouldn't foul my herd by letting them graze on traitor soil. But I promise you this, you'll wish you'd taken it. This town doesn't look kindly on your kind." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Silas, you'd be wise to reconsider who you do business with." He swept his gaze over the other patrons. "All of you." With that, he and his men strode out, leaving a thick, poisonous silence in their wake. Silas Croft wrung his hands, his face pale with sweat. "Martha, I can't." "I understand, Silas," she said quietly. She placed a few coins on the counter for the flour, leaving the coffee she could no longer afford. She scooped up her sack and walked out, the eyes of the entire store following her. The street was a gauntlet of hostile stares. Women who had once shared quilting patterns with her now pulled their children close, turning their faces away as she passed. Men who had shared a drink with Sean now spat tobacco juice near her feet. In the space of a single morning, she had become an outcast, a pariah. As she was untying Bartholomew, a hand touched her arm. She flinched, spinning around to see the town's physician, Doc Miller, a weary man with kind eyes and whiskey on his breath. "You all right, Martha?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine, Doc." "No, you're not," he countered, glancing nervously up and down the street. "Kane's been whipping this up for 2 days. He's got folks scared. They see a Lakota gift and think it's a prelude to an attack. They think you've endangered them all." He sighed, adjusting his spectacles. "What you did was decent. Christian, even. But decency is in short supply around here. Be careful, Martha. Kane's not a man to make idle threats. He sees your land as the final piece of his little empire, and he's just found the excuse he needs to take it. Doc Miller squeezed her arm, a small gesture of solidarity in a sea of hostility, and then retreated back into the shadows of his office. The ride home was heavy with foreboding. The beautiful white landscape no longer seemed pure. It seemed empty, isolating. Redemption Gulch had shown its true face. It was a community bound not by fellowship, but by a shared and easily manipulated fear, and Jedediah Kane was the master manipulator. She arrived back at her cabin as dusk was settling. The gifts which had seemed like a miracle at dawn now felt like a curse. They were the evidence of her crime, the justification for Kane's crusade against her. As she stabled Bartholomew, a glint of light from the north ridge caught her eye. It was a man on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. He was just sitting there, watching her homestead. Watching her. The siege had begun. The days that followed bled into a week of slow, creeping dread. The man on the ridge was a constant presence, sometimes one rider, sometimes two. They were Kane's men. They didn't do anything, not at first. They just watched. Their stillness was a form of psychological warfare, a constant unnerving reminder that she was isolated, exposed, and at the mercy of a man who had none. Martha's routine became a testament to her resilience. She rose before dawn, tended her animals, and fortified her home. She double-checked the locks, reinforced the shutter on the small back window, and kept Sean's shotgun loaded and leaning against the wall nearest the hearth. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The loneliness she had once endured had been replaced by a terrifying solitude. She was a prisoner in her own home. The first direct act came a week after her visit to town. She woke to a sound of frantic clucking from the chicken coop. Rushing outside, she found the door torn from its leather hinges and the wire mesh ripped open. 2 of her 5 hens were gone, and the pristine snow was dotted with feathers and the tracks of a large dog leading back towards Kane's property. It was a petty, cruel act, designed not just to steal, but to intimidate. It was a message. We can get to you whenever we want. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, the shotgun heavy on her lap, and watched the fire burn down to embers, listening. 2 nights later they targeted Bartholomew. She was jolted from a light doze by the mule's terrified braying. She burst outside to see 2 riders galloping away from her small corral, their laughter carrying on the cold night air. The corral gate was wide open, and Bartholomew was gone. Panic raw and absolute seized her. The mule was her only transport, her only way to haul firewood, her only link to the outside world. Without him, she was truly stranded. For the first time since Sean's death, Martha broke down. She sank to her knees in the snow, the cold seeping into her bones, and wept. Sobs of fear, of rage, of utter despair tore from her throat. They were winning. Kane was winning. He was dismantling her life piece by piece, and no one was coming to help. The law in Redemption Gulch was Sheriff Brody, a man who owed his position to Kane's influence. He might offer sympathy, but he would never offer a hand. As her tears subsided, a different emotion began to burn in their place: anger, a cold, hard fury that displaced the fear. She would not be broken. This was her land, bought and paid for with Sean's sweat and her own. She would not be scared off it by a bully and his hired thugs. She spent the next day tracking Bartholomew. His tracks, deeper and rounder than those of a horse, were easy to follow in the snow. They led not towards Kane's main ranch, but towards the contested creek that separated their properties. As she crested a small hill, she saw him. He was tied to a cottonwood tree, looking miserable but unharmed. And just beyond him, She saw what made her blood run cold. Cain had finally done it. His men had built a crude but effective dam of rock and logs across the creek. The water level on his side was already rising, creating a stagnant pool for his cattle. On her side, the creek had been reduced to a pathetic trickle. Her well fed by the aquifer connected to that creek would be dry by summer. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct assault on her ability to survive on this land. It was a declaration of war. She untied Bartholomew, her mind racing. She was one woman against a wealthy rancher and his crew. The law was on his side. The town was against her. She had no allies, no one to turn to. Or did she? Her hand went to her pocket, where she now kept the hawk feather. She thought of the little boy, his quiet dignity, and the astonishing generosity of his people. They had thanked her for an act of simple humanity. What Cain was doing wasn't just a crime against her. It was a desecration. Sean had told her that Grove of Cottonwoods was a sacred place for the Lakota, a place where they harvested ceremonial bark and communed with their spirits. Cain's dam was a boot on the neck of her homestead, but it was also a profound insult to them. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in her mind. It was a wild gamble, a leap of faith into a world she didn't understand. But Cain had left her no other choice. He had choked off her water and her hope, forcing her to seek help from the very people he had used to condemn her. That evening, as the sun began to set, she did something she would never have imagined possible a month ago. She walked to the highest point of her property, a small knoll overlooking the vast, empty plains to the east. She took the eagle feather, the one left, as a gift of honor, and tied it to the top of a tall, dead yucca stalk, so that it might flutter in the wind. Then below it, she built a small, smoky fire of damp sagebrush, just as she'd once seen a lost Cheyenne scout do years ago. She didn't know if it was the right signal. She didn't know if anyone would see it. She didn't even know if it was a signal for help or a signal for war. All she knew was that she had made her choice on the night of the blizzard, and now she would see the consequences through to the end. She was no longer just Martha O'Connell, the quiet widow. She was a woman fighting for her home, and she was sending up a prayer of smoke into the darkening sky. For 2 days, there was no answer. The smoke from her signal fire had dissipated into the vast, indifferent sky, and the only response was the continued silent vigil of Cain's rider on the ridge. A cold knot of despair began to tighten in Martha's stomach. Perhaps they hadn't seen it. Perhaps they didn't care about the desecrated creek. Or perhaps, worst of all, they saw her, a white woman, as part of the problem, her small fire, an insignificant speck in a landscape of betrayal. Bartholomew's return had clearly angered Cain. The harassment escalated. One evening a rock shattered her window, spraying the cabin with glass and frigid air. The next morning she found the words "Indian lover" scrawled in charcoal across her barn door. Each act was a turn of the screw designed to break her spirit. She patched the window with oiled parchment and scrubbed the hateful words from the wood, her jaw set in a grim, determined line. She was running on little more than coffee, and stubbornness, her sleep shattered by the constant need for vigilance. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was sitting at her table, trying to mend a shirt by the flickering lamplight, the shotgun resting against the table leg. A floorboard creaked behind her. She moved in a single fluid motion, born of pure terror, grabbing the shotgun and spinning around, leveling it at the intruder. He stood in the shadows just inside the door, which was closed and bolted as she had left it. He had not made a sound. He was a tall, powerfully built man, his face a mask of stern, deep-set lines that spoke of hardship and authority. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, and a single eagle feather was tied in his long, grey-streaked hair. He was not alone. Behind him, melting into the deeper shadows of the cabin, stood two other warriors, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. Martha's heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest, but she held the shotgun steady, its twin barrels aimed at the leader's chest. The man raised a hand palm open, the universal sign of peace. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. He spoke in the Lakota tongue, a language she did not understand. From behind him, a small figure emerged. It was the boy. He looked different now. The fear was gone from his eyes, replaced with a solemn confidence. He was dressed in warm furs, and he looked healthy and strong. He stepped forward and spoke, his voice clear in the tense silence of the room. "He is my father," the boy said, in heavily accented, but clear English. "He is Chief Black Buffalo Horn." Martha slowly, hesitantly lowered the shotgun. A chief, standing in her cabin. She had harbored his son, and now the father had come in person. She didn't know the protocol, the custom. She was terrifyingly out of her depth. "He says," the boy continued, looking at his father, who spoke again in a low tone, "he says they do not use the door. The door is for enemies and strangers. The wall is for friends who need help." He gestured vaguely at the back wall, and Martha understood with a jolt that they had somehow slipped through the shuttered window she had repaired as silent as smoke. Black Buffalo Horn spoke again, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, noting the patched window, the shotgun, the exhaustion etched onto Martha's face. The boy translated. "He saw your smoke. He saw the feather of honor. He says the woman who fights the white wolf to save a child is a woman whose fire deserves an answer. He asks why you call." Taking a shaky breath, Martha found her voice. She told them everything. She told them about Cain, about the town turning against her, about the stolen chickens, the opened corral, the broken window. And then she told them about the dam. As the boy translated this last part, a flicker of something hard and cold passed through the chief's eyes. When Martha finished, he spoke a single, sharp command. One of the other warriors slipped out of the cabin as silently as he had entered. "He wants to see," the boy said. Martha led them out into the moonlit snow. The air was still and bitterly cold. She led the chief and his son to the ridge overlooking the dammed creek. Black Buffalo Horn stood for a long time, staring down at the ugly scar of rock and logs, at the choked trickle of water, at the desecrated grove of cottonwoods. The moonlight cast his face in silver and shadow, making his expression unreadable. But Martha could feel a palpable anger radiating from him, as controlled and dangerous as a banked fire. He spoke, his voice low and guttural. "The spirits of the trees weep." The boy translated his own small voice, filled with a profound gravity. "This man Cain, he steals the water life of the land. He has done this before, farther north. He poisons the earth for the sake of his fat, spotted buffalo." The warrior who had left earlier reappeared at the chief's side. He handed his leader an object. It was a surveying stake, wooden with one end hammered into a point. Carved into its side were the initials JK, but wrapped around the top, tied with a leather thong, was a small, intricately beaded amulet. Black Buffalo Horn held it out for Martha to see. "My son, he lost this on the night of the storm," the boy explained. "It was a gift from his mother. We tracked him, but the storm covered his path. Then we found this." The chief spoke again, his gaze fixed on Martha. "He says his warrior found this stake 2 days ago, a mile east of here, on our land. Cain marks new boundaries. He means to take this land and the land of our ancestors." The boy's translation was somber. The amulet lost in the snow by the boy had been found by Kane's men as they scouted, and they had mockingly tied it to their surveying stake, a piece of damning evidence. Kane wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was in the process of actively stealing land, both hers and the Lakotas. Suddenly it all clicked into place. The gifts on the porch were not just a thank you. They were a strategic move. Black Buffalo Horn knew that by bestowing such a magnificent public gift, he was tying Martha's fate to his. He was forcing Kane's hand, drawing him out, making him reveal the true depths of his greed. Her small fire of damp sagebrush had not been a call for help. It had been the answer to a question they were already asking. "Your fight is now our fight," the boy said, his dark eyes meeting hers. "My father says the man who builds a dam of stone will find it broken by a flood of justice. We will not ride on your cabin with guns. That is the white man's way. Our way is different. Be in the town in 2 days, at noon. Be ready." Before Martha could ask what he meant, before she could process the terrifying, exhilarating reality of this new alliance, they were gone. They didn't walk away. They simply melted back into the moon-drenched landscape of snow and shadow, leaving her alone on the ridge, the cold wind whispering secrets she was only just beginning to understand. The next 2 days were the longest of Martha's life. She did as she was told, making her preparations, her mind, a whirlwind of fear and fragile hope. What did Black Buffalo Horn have planned? A violent confrontation would only lead to a massacre with the full weight of the U.S. cavalry coming down on them all. But the chief had promised something different. A flood of justice. On the appointed day, she hitched Bartholomew to her small wagon and began the slow journey to Redemption Gulch. She wore the beaded moccasins, a silent declaration of her allegiance. As she rode, she saw them. On the ridges to the north and south, small groups of Lakota warriors sat on their ponies, motionless watching. They were not hiding. They were a silent, ominous audience, their presence a clear message to anyone who might be watching. When she arrived in Redemption Gulch, the main street was tense. Word had clearly spread. Dozens of Lakota warriors had been seen on the horizon, not charging but observing. The townsfolk were gathered in nervous clusters, rifles held loosely in their hands. Sheriff Brody stood on the porch of his office, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. And there in the middle of the street stood Jedediah Kane, and a dozen of his men, armed to the teeth. He looked triumphant, as if this was the very confrontation he had been hoping for. "Look here," Kane bellowed, as Martha pulled her wagon to a halt. "The traitor comes to meet her friends. Did you think a few savages on a hill would scare us, Martha? You've just started a war, and you've brought it right to our doorstep." "I haven't brought anything. Jedediah." Martha said, her voice clear and steady as she climbed down from the wagon. "I've just come to see justice done." Just as she spoke, a new sound reached them. Not the thunder of hooves, but a low, powerful rumble. From the east, entering the town at a slow, deliberate walk, came Chief Black Buffalo Horn. He was not dressed for war. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. He was flanked by his son and the 2 warriors from Martha's cabin. They were unarmed. Behind them, however, came the source of the rumbling. 2 Lakota men were leading a pair of strong ponies, and between the ponies they were dragging a travois. But instead of carrying supplies, this travois was carrying a huge, tangled mess of freshly cut logs and rocks, still dripping with muddy water. It was the wreckage of Kane's dam. They dragged it to the center of the street and left it there, a heap of evidence for the whole town to see. Kane's face went from smug to purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this? That's my property." Black Buffalo Horn didn't look at Kane. He looked at Sheriff Brody. He spoke, and his son translated his young voice, ringing with an authority that belied his age. This man, Jedediah Cain, has violated the Treaty of 68. He has built this dam on land that feeds the sacred groves. This is an act of war against my people. That's a lie, Cain sputtered. That creek is on my land. Is it? Martha's voice cut through the tension. She walked to her wagon and pulled out the surveying stake his men had left the beaded amulet still tied to it. She held it up for the sheriff to see. Sheriff Brody, I found this on my property, well past my fence line. And I believe the land office maps will show that the creek in question doesn't belong to Mr. Cain at all. It's federal territory designated as a right-of-way, meaning no one has the right to block it. Sheriff Brody's eyes widened slightly. He knew she was right. Sean had told her as much years ago. It was the one legal point he had always planned to use against Cain. Furthermore, Martha continued, her confidence growing. Mr. Cain has been running a campaign of terror against a citizen of this town. He has stolen my livestock, destroyed my property, and threatened my life. She's a liar, a traitor. Cain roared his hand, moving toward his gun. But before he could draw, Black Buffalo Horn spoke again, his voice like the crack of a whip. His son translated. He also steals from his own people. The chief pointed a finger not at Cain, but at one of the ranch hands standing beside him. A young man who looked pale and terrified. This man's father sold cattle to Cain a month ago. He was paid only half what was promised. Cain said the rest of the herd was sick. A lie. He then pointed to another man. This man's prospecting claim was jumped last week. The new filings bear the name of a man who works for Cain. A murmur went through the crowd. These were not Lakota grievances. These were the town's own secrets, their own quiet resentments against Cain's tyrannical greed, now laid bare in the muddy street by a man they considered a savage. This is not a war between the Lakota and the settlers. The boy's voice rang out, translating his father's powerful words. This is a war between a man who respects the land and the law, and a man who respects only his own greed. We did not come here to fight you. We came here to show you the wolf who has been living in your flock. The spell was broken. The townsfolk were no longer looking at the Lakota on the hills. They were looking at Jedediah Cain, seeing him not as their protector, but as their oppressor. They were looking at the evidence of the dam, the surveying stake, and the truth in their own hearts. Sheriff Brody finally moved. He drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at the chief. He pointed it squarely at Jedediah Cain. Jedediah, the sheriff said, his voice heavy with resignation. You're under arrest. For property damage, for theft, for witness intimidation. I'm sure we can think of a few more. For a moment, Cain looked like he might fight, but he looked at the faces of the townsfolk who offered him no support. He looked at the hard, unyielding stare of Black Buffalo Horn, and he looked at the silent, watching warriors on the hills. He was alone. His empire built on fear had crumbled when faced with a different kind of strength. He dropped his gun belt into the mud. As Cain's own men refused to help, and the sheriff took him into custody, Black Buffalo Horn turned to Martha. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of respect, between equals, a recognition of the courage she had shown. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, he and his warriors turned and walked away, leaving the town of Redemption Gulch to reckon with its own soul. Martha stood by her wagon, the hawk feather still in her pocket, a bridge between two worlds. Her life would never be simple again, but for the first time in a long time, she no longer felt alone. Martha O'Connell's story is a powerful reminder that the history of the West wasn't just written with bullets and bloodshed. It was also written in quiet acts of courage, in moments of compassion that defied the hatred of the times. She didn't just shelter a child, She sheltered the possibility of a different future, one where respect was answered with respect, and kindness was a force more powerful than greed. Her story shows us that a single choice made in the heart of a storm can build a bridge that saves not just one life, but the very soul of a community. If this piece of history moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates tales of the real untamed West. And don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the dusty annals of the American frontier. Thank you for listening.